refreshing a page that hasn't changed, opening an app you just closed 30 seconds ago, looking for a sign, a status, a small flicker of information about someone who may not even be thinking about you at all. You tell yourself you'll stop after this one look. You never stop after this one look. And if you've ever wondered why a habit this small can feel this impossible to control, the answer isn't weakness. It's architecture. And Carl Jung understood the shape of it long before smartphones existed. He never used the word profile, of course, but he spent decades studying exactly the psychological mechanism now playing out millions of times a day on glowing rectangles in people's pockets. Jung believed the unconscious mind doesn't tolerate incompleteness well. When something important remains unresolved, unanswered, unfinished, the psyche doesn't quietly let it go. It keeps circling back, generating pressure, demanding resolution, whether or not resolution is actually available. What feels like an addiction to checking someone's online presence is, underneath the surface, something closer to an unconscious search for closure that the conscious mind hasn't been given permission to seek directly. Picture the moment right after a conversation ends unresolved. Maybe it was a text that never got a clear response, a relationship that faded without an actual conversation about what happened, a person who simply stopped reaching out and never explained why. In that gap, the mind doesn't rest. It reaches for whatever fragments of information it can find, a last seen timestamp, a new photo, a status update, anything that might fill in the missing piece of a story that never got told. Watch closely, because what you're actually looking for in those moments isn't information about them. It's relief from the specific discomfort of not knowing. A discomfort the mind treats as more urgent than almost anything else it's currently dealing with. Now imagine a slightly different scene, one that has nothing to do with romance at all. A friendship that quietly cooled without either person ever naming what happened. You find yourself, months later, still opening their profile every so often, not because you miss them exactly, but because something about the unexplained distance still itches at the back of your mind. You tell yourself you're just curious, just checking in passively, nothing more. But notice the specific timing of these visits. They tend to cluster around moments when you're already feeling uncertain about your own standing somewhere else, a different friendship, a work relationship, your place in a group. The old unresolved thread gets pulled on precisely when a new uncertainty makes the original one flare back up, as if the mind keeps a running list of every unfinished social account it has ever opened, ready to reactivate any of them the moment a fresh uncertainty makes the old one feel relevant again. This is where psychology becomes uncomfortable, because most people assume this behavior is about the other person, about lingering feelings, about wanting them back. Sometimes that's part of it. But Jung's framework suggests something more unsettling. The compulsion to check isn't really about the person at all. It's about an unfinished psychological process inside you that has attached itself to them as its unresolved object. And until that internal process finds resolution, no amount of checking will ever actually satisfy it. Because checking was never designed to provide the kind of closure the unconscious is actually asking for. Think about the last time you caught yourself refreshing a page, already knowing, rationally, that nothing new would be there. That moment of catching yourself mid-action, already aware of the futility, is worth sitting with. It reveals that this behavior isn't primarily driven by conscious reasoning at all. Something else is running the show. Something faster and more insistent than logic. And understanding what that something is requires looking at a phenomenon psychologists identified decades before social media existed. One that explains this pattern with unsettling precision. That phenomenon has a name, the Zeigarnik effect, named after a psychologist who noticed that waiters could recall the details of unpaid orders with striking clarity, while orders that had already been settled faded from memory almost immediately. Once a task is completed, the mind releases its grip on it. Once a task is left incomplete, the mind holds onto it with disproportionate intensity, running quiet background processes that surface as intrusive thoughts, restlessness, and precisely the kind of compulsive checking behavior that defines an unresolved relationship. An unanswered question about where you stand with someone functions exactly like an unpaid order. The mind cannot fully release it, because from a purely cognitive standpoint, the task was never marked complete. What makes this especially relevant to digital checking behavior is that a profile offers the illusion of an available answer without ever actually providing one. A restaurant order eventually gets paid, closing the loop for good. A relationship's meaning, by contrast, rarely resolves through a single piece of evidence. There is no photo that definitively answers whether someone still thinks about you, no status update that settles what really happened between you. And yet the profile keeps presenting itself as though the answer might be right there, one scroll away, which is precisely what keeps the Zeigarnik loop running far longer than it would for almost any other kind of unfinished task. The mind isn't being irrational when it keeps checking. It's responding accurately to an environment that keeps implying resolution is close, even though the specific resolution being sought was never actually available through that channel. But that isn't the real problem. The real problem is what happens when checking becomes the substitute for the resolution the mind is actually seeking, because it never delivers what it promises. Every glance at their profile offers a tiny hit of information, a photo, a status, an indication of whether they've been active recently. And each of those tiny hits produces a brief, almost imperceptible sense of relief. But that relief evaporates almost instantly, because the actual unresolved question, where do I stand? What happened? Why did this end the way it did? Remains untouched. The checking behavior treats the symptom while leaving the underlying wound completely unaddressed, which means the compulsion has no natural stopping point. It simply repeats. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath the surface of this repetition, because the pattern itself is being reinforced by one of the most powerful mechanisms behavioral psychology has ever identified: variable reinforcement. Most of the time, checking produces nothing new, no update, no fresh information, nothing that changes the picture. But occasionally, unpredictably, it does. A new photo appears, a status changes, something shifts. That unpredictability is precisely what makes the behavior so difficult to extinguish. A reward that arrives on a predictable schedule loses its grip on behavior relatively quickly. A reward that arrives unpredictably, sometimes yes, mostly no, produces the most persistent, compulsive behavioral pattern known to psychology. The same pattern that keeps people pulling the lever on a slot machine long after any rational cost-benefit analysis would have told them to stop. Alfred Adler's work offers a different but complementary explanation for why this particular compulsion feels so personally urgent. Adler believed that human beings are driven by a need for certainty about their own significance, particularly in relationships that matter to their sense of self-worth. When a relationship ends without clear explanation, it doesn't just leave an informational gap, it leaves a significance gap, an unanswered question about what the person's absence or silence actually means about your own value. Checking becomes an attempt to answer that deeper question through indirect evidence, scanning for clues that might confirm or deny a fear that feels too vulnerable to examine directly. Was I not enough? Did I misread something? Does my absence register with them the way theirs registers with me? Most people believe the solution to this compulsion is simply willpower. A firmer resolve to delete the app, block the number, stop looking. And sometimes those actions do help, by removing the immediate opportunity for the behavior. But willpower alone rarely addresses the underlying mechanism, because the compulsion isn't fundamentally about access. It's about an unresolved internal state that will keep generating pressure toward closure, seeking behavior in one form or another, whether the specific outlet is a profile, a mutual friend, or simply an endless internal loop of rumination that produces the same anxious, unresolved feeling without needing a screen at all. Neuroscience adds a striking dimension to why this feels so difficult to simply reason your way out of. Uncertainty itself activates the brain's threat detection circuitry, centered in the amygdala, in ways that are often more intense than the negative information the uncertainty is protecting you from. Studies on decision-making consistently show that people experience more distress anticipating an uncertain negative outcome than they do actually receiving confirmed bad news. This means that in a strange, counterintuitive way, not knowing where you stand with someone can generate more psychological suffering than knowing they've moved on completely. The brain treats ambiguity as more threatening than resolution, even painful resolution, because ambiguity means the threat response system cannot stand down. It has to stay activated, scanning, vigilant, waiting for information that never fully arrives. This is why checking someone's profile so rarely brings the calm it promises, even when the information gathered is neutral or reassuring. The nervous system isn't actually looking for a specific piece of data. It's looking for permission to stop scanning altogether, and no single photo or status update can grant that permission, because the underlying uncertainty about the relationship's meaning remains completely unresolved. Each check becomes a partial, unsatisfying answer to a question that was never really about information in the first place. Most people never notice what comes next in this pattern, which is how the checking behavior begins to distort the very narrative it's trying to complete. Confirmation bias ensures that whatever is found gets interpreted through the lens of whatever fear or hope was already present before the search began. A neutral photo becomes evidence of moving on too quickly if that's the fear being carried, or evidence of lingering feelings if that's the hope being nursed. The profile itself stays static. The meaning assigned to it shifts entirely based on the internal state of the person doing the searching, which means the checking behavior isn't actually gathering objective information at all. It's manufacturing confirmation for a story the mind has already decided to tell. This distortion compounds over repeated checks in a way that rarely gets noticed in the moment. Each interpretation, however small, becomes evidence supporting the next interpretation, until an entire elaborate narrative has been constructed from a handful of photos and timestamps that, viewed by a neutral observer, would tell almost no coherent story at all. The person doing the checking isn't lying to themselves exactly. They are doing something more subtle and more human, filling genuine informational gaps with emotionally convenient explanations, because an uncertain mind finds any story, even a painful one, more tolerable than no story at all. The next realization changes everything, because it reframes the entire nature of the compulsion. If checking isn't really about the other person, if it's about an unresolved internal state seeking closure through an object incapable of actually providing it, then the solution was never going to be found by staring harder at someone else's digital footprint. Jung would call this a projection of unfinished internal business onto an external screen, a search for resolution in exactly the place resolution cannot be found, because the resolution being sought was never actually external to begin with. Evolutionary psychology offers a final layer that helps explain why this particular kind of uncertainty feels so viscerally urgent rather than merely annoying. For most of human history, social bonds were directly tied to survival. Knowing where you stood within your tribe, whether you were still accepted, still valued, still safely connected to the group that provided protection and resources, was not a minor emotional concern. It was existential. The nervous system that evolved under those conditions did not distinguish between social uncertainty and physical danger with much precision, because for most of evolutionary history, they were functionally the same thing. Losing standing within the group could mean losing access to food, protection, and survival itself. This is why modern social ambiguity, something as seemingly minor as an unclear relationship status, can trigger a threat response entirely disproportionate to its actual present-day stakes. You are not overreacting. You are running ancient software that has not yet caught up to the fact that a cooled friendship or a faded romance no longer threatens your physical survival the way tribal exile once did. Viktor Frankl's understanding of meaning offers a way through this compulsion that doesn't require pretending the uncertainty doesn't hurt. Frankl believed that meaning is found not by escaping discomfort, but by choosing how to relate to it, and this distinction matters enormously here. The uncertainty about where you stand with someone may not resolve on any timeline you control. But the compulsive checking is not the only possible response to that uncertainty. Between the discomfort of not knowing and the automatic reach for your phone lies a space. And within that space is the same freedom Frankl insisted remains available even under circumstances we cannot change. The freedom to choose whether this particular moment of uncertainty gets to dictate the next action you take. The Stoics built an entire practical discipline around exactly this kind of ungovernable uncertainty. Epictetus taught that suffering arises not from events themselves, but from our judgments about them, and that clarity begins the moment we separate what is within our control from what is not. Whether someone else thinks of you, misses you, or has moved on entirely sits firmly outside your control. What remains within your control is considerably smaller, but far more useful. Whether you spend the next 10 minutes feeding an unanswerable question, or redirecting that same attention towards something that can actually be resolved. Seneca wrote about the particular torment of anticipating what cannot be known, insisting that far more suffering comes from imagined uncertainty than from confronted reality. Marcus Aurelius, governing an empire full of genuinely unresolved threats, kept returning to a single discipline, attending to what was actually in front of him, rather than what might be happening somewhere he could not see. This is where awareness starts to change behavior, not by eliminating the pull toward checking entirely, because the Zeigarnik effect doesn't simply switch off because you've identified it, but by recognizing the urge for what it actually is the moment it arises. The impulse to check is not a message about the other person. It's a signal that some part of your internal narrative feels unfinished, and the practical work is redirecting that signal toward genuine resolution rather than false, temporary relief. Sometimes that means writing down, privately, the actual unanswered question you're carrying, giving it words instead of letting it circulate wordlessly as an urge to refresh a screen. Sometimes it means allowing yourself to accept, deliberately and without needing new evidence, that some questions will simply remain open, and that living with an open question is different from being controlled by one. There is a specific, almost counterintuitive technique worth naming here. Rather than trying to suppress the urge to check, which tends to backfire the way suppressing any strong urge usually does, the more effective approach is often to complete the loop artificially, on your own terms, without needing external evidence at all. This might mean explicitly acknowledging to yourself that the relationship's meaning may never be fully explained, and choosing, consciously, to file the question as closed regardless. This isn't the same as pretending you have an answer you don't have. It's a deliberate act of granting yourself the permission to stop scanning that the outside world was never going to provide. The mind, it turns out, doesn't actually require a real answer to release an unfinished loop. It sometimes only requires a decision, made with enough conviction, that the loop is finished anyway. Jung believed that psychological maturity required exactly this kind of tolerance for ambiguity, the capacity to hold an unresolved question without needing to immediately collapse it into false certainty one way or another. He called the alternative to this maturity a kind of unconscious possession, being run by a compulsion rather than consciously choosing a response to it. Learning to sit with the discomfort of not knowing without reaching reflexively for the false resolution a screen appears to offer, is one of the clearest practical expressions of what Jung meant by individuation. Becoming a person capable of holding complexity, rather than one perpetually driven by the unconscious need to resolve it prematurely. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives, usually gradually, once this pattern is finally seen clearly. The compulsion doesn't necessarily vanish overnight, but its grip loosens because it's no longer operating in the dark, mistaken for genuine curiosity or lingering love, when it was actually the unconscious mind's attempt to close a loop that a screen was never capable of closing in the first place. So here is the question worth carrying with you after this ends. If the thing you're really searching for every time you check isn't information about them, but resolution within yourself, what would it take to finally give yourself that resolution directly, without waiting for a photo, a status, or a stranger's silence to grant you permission to stop looking? If this kind of psychology, the kind that looks past the surface and into the quiet architecture of why we actually do what we do, is something you genuinely find valuable, consider staying around for what comes next. Subscribe if this resonated with you, not out of obligation, only if you want more of these ideas finding their way into your life.